I'm not going to preempt the Office of Budget Responsibility's forecast, but the world has changed. We can all see that before our eyes. And government are not inactive in that. We'll respond to the change and continue to meet our fiscal rules, but we're also shaping the new world, whether that's in the defence and security realm or indeed on the economy. I promised at the general election to bring stability back to the economy. As a result of that stability, interest rates have been cut 3 times since the general election. That's a far cry from the 11% inflation and the interest rate hikes that we saw under the previous government. And that's only been possible because we've put our public finances on a firm footing, and we've also put our public services on a firm footing, which is what I did in the budget last year.
In a recent appearance on Trevor Phillips' show, Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor of the Labour Party, found herself embroiled in a tense political exchange that has rocked the UK. Faced with tough questioning and sharp criticisms, particularly about her government's handling of the ongoing financial crisis, Reeves maintained a firm stance, though to many, her responses seemed increasingly disconnected from the struggles of ordinary people. The discussion quickly turned to Labour's controversial fiscal decisions, especially tax increases, which critics argue have worsened the cost of living crisis. The conversation exposed a growing divide between the leadership of the Labour Party and the lived experiences of the public. Despite overwhelming evidence from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation warning that living standards are set to decline significantly over the next 5 years, Reeves confidently dismissed these concerns, insisting the economy was improving. She claimed that wages were outpacing inflation and that living standards were rising under her leadership. However, her optimism appeared out of touch with the reality that millions of people across the country are battling rising energy costs, stagnant wages, and the escalating price of basic necessities. As the interview unfolded, it became evident that Reeves' version of events was increasingly at odds with the harsh financial difficulties faced by everyday Britons. Her refusal to acknowledge the severity of the situation, especially the alarming predictions of worsening living standards, only fueled the public's growing disillusionment with the Labour Party. While she defended her government's fiscal policies as essential for long-term stability, her claims that everything was improving were unconvincing to many critics. They pointed out that the very policies she supported, including cuts to benefits and higher taxes, were making life more difficult for the working-class families Labour once championed. The backlash was swift and relentless. Many accused Reeves of being out of touch with the real struggles of the British public, claiming her failure to confront the hard truths of the cost of living crisis only deepened dissatisfaction with the party's leadership. As the interview progressed, it became clear that Reeves' confidence was increasingly at odds with the mounting frustration across the country. The growing question became whether the Labour Party truly understood the scale of the challenges faced by millions of Britons. With each passing day, it became more apparent that Reeves' optimism was failing to resonate with the electorate, and that Labour's credibility was rapidly fading. The interview not only exposed fissures within Labour's leadership, but also highlighted a broader issue: a political system increasingly detached from the real needs of the people. Rachel Reeves' appearance on Trevor Phillips' show has raised serious questions about her leadership and the credibility of the Labour Party under her direction. Throughout the interview, her attempts to portray an optimistic view of the UK's economy were met with skepticism and growing criticism from both the public and political analysts. The main point of contention was the clear contrast between Reeves' optimistic portrayal of economic recovery and the harsh realities facing millions of working-class families. She confidently argued that living standards were improving and wages were growing faster than inflation. However, expert reports, including one from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, presented a very different picture. According to the foundation, living standards were projected to drop significantly in the coming years, particularly for the UK's most vulnerable households, with inflation continuing to rise and wages stagnating, pushing many families deeper into poverty. Despite this, Reeves maintained that the Labour government had set the economy on a positive path. Her refusal to accept expert findings and acknowledge the worsening financial situation for ordinary citizens sparked doubts about her grasp on the crisis. For millions struggling with rising costs of living such as food, energy, and housing, her reassurances felt detached from their everyday reality. As she continued defending the government's approach, it became evident that Reeves either failed or refused to face the full scale of the problems the public was enduring. Her rhetoric about economic recovery seemed increasingly hollow, especially when weighed against overwhelming evidence of financial mismanagement and widening inequality. Critics quickly pointed out that her confident statements about wage increases ignored the fact that these increases were still insufficient to match the rapid rise in living expenses. Furthermore, her claims about improvements in public services were contradicted by the ongoing problems in the NHS, including longer waiting times and the continued pressure on local councils and other essential services. Reeves' defensiveness only reinforced the perception that Labour's leadership was out of touch with the very people it claimed to represent. While the party had long positioned itself as a champion of working-class people, many began questioning whether Labour had truly adapted its priorities to the economic crisis. The backlash came not only from political opponents, but also from within the party, with some Labour MPs publicly distancing themselves from her claims. As the interview continued, it became apparent that Reeves' handling of the situation was only worsening the public's growing disillusionment with the Labour Party. Her failure to address the scale of the economic crisis or propose viable solutions left many wondering whether Labour was capable of leading the country through such turbulent times. The widening gap between Reeves' idealistic narrative and the reality of the cost of living crisis was undeniable, and with every passing moment, Labour's credibility seemed to diminish further. Rachel Reeves' recent appearance on Trevor Phillips' show has fueled widespread discontent, particularly due to her dismissal of the growing economic instability, despite the undeniable hardships faced by millions of British families. Throughout the interview, Reeves' insistence on presenting an optimistic outlook for the UK economy seemed increasingly out of sync with the everyday reality of the public. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation's report, which forecasted a bleak economic future, predicted a continued decline in living standards, especially among the poorest households. In spite of this grim assessment, Reeves stuck firmly to her narrative, claiming that wages were outpacing inflation and that living standards were improving. This narrative was not just a misunderstanding of the data, but a blatant refusal to acknowledge the suffering experienced by countless families. For those struggling with rising energy costs, grocery prices, and rent hikes, Reeves' statement seemed not only irrelevant but dismissive. Her unwillingness to recognize the ongoing cost of living crisis and stagnant wages undermined the credibility of her claims. What was presented as progress in the economy appeared more like a politically motivated effort to deflect blame and maintain a sense of control, rather than a genuine reflection of the nation's economic situation. It became increasingly apparent that Reeves' rhetoric was disconnected from the lived experiences of many citizens. The evidence provided by economists and the Office for Budget Responsibility contradicted her assertions. Inflation remained persistently high, and while wages had risen, they were still insufficient to keep up with the escalating cost of living. Yet Reeves persisted in dismissing expert opinions and brushing off public concerns. This approach alienated many, making them feel that the government was ignoring their struggles. The growing frustration among the public was palpable, as more people expressed their disillusionment with Labour's leadership. In the face of overwhelming criticism, Reeves' unwavering defence of the government's actions seemed more like a refusal to acknowledge the full scale of the crisis. While some MPs attempted to stand by her, the intensifying backlash made it clear that public trust in her leadership was rapidly evaporating. The underlying issue wasn't just economic mismanagement, it was the increasing perception that the Labour Party, once a champion of the working class, had become out of touch with the very people it aimed to serve. The divide between Labour's promises and the harsh economic reality faced by millions was glaring. As support for the government continued to dwindle, it became clear that Labour's credibility was in jeopardy, hanging by a fragile thread. Rachel Reeves' appearance on Trevor Phillips' show seemed to only exacerbate the crisis surrounding her leadership and the Labour Party's diminishing credibility. Despite overwhelming evidence highlighting the country's ongoing economic troubles, she persisted in defending her government's approach. With an almost unsettling level of optimism, her consistent claims that wages were outpacing inflation and that the economy was on an upward trajectory stood in stark contrast to both expert warnings and the harsh realities faced by millions of Britons. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation's report, which predicted a severe decline in living standards over the next 5 years, painted a far bleaker picture of the UK's future. For many families struggling to make ends meet, this was not just an abstract prediction, it was a daily challenge. Yet, instead of acknowledging the concerns raised by these reports, Reeves focused on abstract economic projections, that many saw as disconnected from the real struggles faced by ordinary people. The public and political analysts responded quickly, their criticism intensifying as it became evident that Reeves' refusal to face the truth of the cost of living crisis was not a simple mistake. It was a clear sign of how disconnected she had become from those her party purported to represent. Many wondered if her continued defense of policies that clearly weren't working was a deliberate attempt to preserve her political position, or simply stubbornness in the face of mounting evidence. Regardless, the damage to her credibility was undeniable. The combination of high inflation, stagnant wages, and soaring costs for essentials like food, energy, and housing made Reeves' reassurances seem increasingly hollow. For most people, her defense of the government's economic policies wasn't about offering hope, but about avoiding accountability. The public's frustration reached a boiling point, and it was no longer something that could be brushed aside as mere political noise. The failure to address the real economic struggles people were enduring began to feel like a betrayal. While Reeves continued to press on with her message of economic recovery, the rising number of resignations within the Labour Party indicated that even her colleagues were losing confidence in the narrative she was pushing. The widening gap between the leadership's optimistic messages and the reality on the ground was becoming too large to ignore. With public trust in Labour rapidly deteriorating, it was evident that the party was facing a critical moment. The ongoing crisis had exposed significant flaws in Labour's economic strategy, and as the pressure mounted, the question loomed: could Reeves regain her position, or would the growing discontent among the public mark the end of her leadership? The ongoing crisis surrounding Rachel Reeves and her leadership of the Labour Party deepened further following her recent interview, where her responses only highlighted the growing public frustration. Despite clear evidence of financial mismanagement and increasing dissatisfaction from the public, Reeves appeared either unwilling or incapable of recognizing the full extent of the crisis. Her claims that the economy was improving and that wages were growing faster than inflation sharply contradicted the harsh reality faced by millions of British families. For these families, the situation was far from improving. While inflation had slightly slowed, it remained stubbornly high, and although wages saw modest increases, they were still not enough to keep up with the rapid rise in the cost of essentials. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation's report forecast a significant decline in living standards, particularly affecting the country's most vulnerable populations. However, Reeves dismissed these warnings, refusing to acknowledge the severity of the situation and continuing to defend policies that clearly were not working. This response seemed more like an attempt to spin the narrative than a genuine effort to address the pressing issues at hand. As the public's frustration grew, it became clear that they were no longer willing to accept optimistic rhetoric or vague promises. People demanded real, actionable solutions to the mounting challenges they faced. The cost of living crisis had left millions of working-class families struggling to afford even the most basic necessities. And instead of offering practical remedies, the Labour Party seemed mired in denial and defensiveness. The gap between the government's optimistic messaging and the reality of the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. Increasingly, Labour MPs were distancing themselves from Reeves and her leadership, indicating a growing division within the party. As Labour faced internal turmoil, it became evident that the party's grip on power was slipping. The inability to engage with the electorate's most urgent concerns was proving to be disastrous for the party. Despite Reeves' best efforts to maintain a positive outlook, the growing disillusionment with her leadership was becoming harder to ignore. The cracks in her leadership were becoming more apparent, and the longer she clung to unrealistic optimism, the more difficult it would be for her to regain the public's trust. The once stronghold of the Labour Party seemed to be faltering, and the public's patience with its leadership was swiftly running out. As Rachel Reeves continued to defend her government's economic decisions, the mounting pressure on her leadership grew stronger. While she confidently assured that the economy was improving and public finances were stabilizing, the reality presented by experts and ordinary citizens contradicted her claims. The Chief Justice's ruling had already dealt a significant blow to Labour's credibility, and Reeves' dismissive stance toward the financial mismanagement only escalated the crisis. The £22 billion originally allocated for essential public services had disappeared under her watch, leaving the public in outrage. Rather than taking responsibility or acknowledging the gravity of the situation, Reeves offered vague justifications, downplaying the issue as a byproduct of previous governmental failures. The absence of transparency and accountability had become a significant hurdle in Labour's struggle to maintain public trust. The more Reeves insisted on the improvements, the more the public questioned her ability to grasp the severity of the crisis. The dissatisfaction wasn't confined to the general populace, but was also reverberating within Labour itself. Senior party members who had once supported Starmer were now distancing themselves, unwilling to be tied to the growing allegations of financial negligence. A sense of betrayal was taking root within the party as it became clear that the leadership had failed to uphold the principles that once defined Labour. With every passing day, the party's position weakened. Labour's historical ties to the working class were being undermined by its failure to address the pressing issues faced by millions of everyday people. Reeves' continued optimism about wage growth and economic recovery seemed completely out of touch with the reality of skyrocketing costs and stagnant incomes. As inflation outpaced wage increases, countless families felt the financial strain, yet Reeves persisted in offering empty assurances rather than proposing tangible solutions. The disconnect between her narrative and the lived experiences of the public became too pronounced to ignore. The growing pressure for change, both from within Labour and the general public, was pushing the party into a challenging situation. If Labour hoped to regain credibility and restore trust, it would have to face its failures directly and present meaningful policies to address the ongoing cost of living crisis. The political landscape was evolving rapidly, and it remained uncertain whether Labour, under Reeves' leadership, could reclaim its relevance. See you later.